This recording is produced by the Spoken Word, Post Office Box 277, Greenville, Indiana. Zip code 47124. All rights reserved. Any duplication of this material is prohibited. The audio quality of this recording is fully guaranteed. If you are not completely satisfied with the audio quality, return this recording for a full refund.
Beyond the azure blue, a God concealed from human sight. He did disguise his heavenly view, and framed the world with his strange mind. There is the God, in the light, in him we live, and we survive.
I'm very grateful for your presence tonight. Our attendance, of course, is somewhat smaller than last night. However, we expected it to be so because this is Wednesday night and other congregations are having their regular midweek service at this time, and consequently a great number could not come that might otherwise have been here. So we appreciate very much the presence of everyone who is here, and trust that by the study of the things that I have in mind tonight, your time may be well spent in coming, that each of us may have a better understanding of some of those things revealed to us in the blessed book of God. The subject for our study tonight is a continuation of those ideas and thoughts that have been presented during the two previous nights. And this subject may be called authority by example. Or in other words, when do examples become patterns? I presented to you last night in our study of the subject of congregational cooperation the pattern of New Testament cooperation as laid down in God's book. In every case we found that the cooperation was made direct to the place that was in need, or the congregation sent their funds to the church that was in a condition of need and distress. No other kind did we find except that. This we took to be a pattern for us to follow in our congregational cooperation today. However, a great many have insisted that such a pattern is not binding, or such example is not binding in the matter of benevolence and cooperation. Hence the importance of studying the subject tonight to determine just when examples are binding, or when do examples become patterns. For a long time we have insisted that there are three ways by which we have divine authority for things. In the first place, by means of a specific statement or a direct commandment. In the second place, by reason of an approved example. In the third place, by a necessary inference. We want to call attention to those three avenues of proof, and in order to illustrate it, we'll call your attention to some matters involved in the New Testament record by way of introducing the things that I want to say concerning this subject. We might take, for example, or for our study just this time, to illustrate it, the Lord's Supper. We have this service bound upon us today by means of a specific or direct commandment. The Lord, the night in which he was betrayed, instituted the supper that we call the Lord's Supper. He used the bread and the fruit of the vine and said the bread was his broken body and the fruit of the vine was his blood that was shed for our sins. He commanded his disciples to do this in remembrance of me. In that commandment he gave, he commanded them to eat the bread in memory of his body, to drink with the fruit of the vine in memory of his blood. We have therefore the obligation of partaking of that institution laid upon us by way of a direct or specific commandment. But that isn't all that's involved in the service. When is that service to be observed? Upon what day are we to partake of the Lord's Supper? There's nothing in the commandment that the Lord gave to tell us anything about when it was to be done. The commandment simply said to do this, without specifying anything about the time in which it was to be observed. However, we learn when the Lord's Supper is to be observed by way of an approved example. In the 20th chapter of the book of Acts, in the 7th verse, we're told that upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, and then he did speech until midnight. In this we have revealed to us the authority for the time to observe the Lord's Supper. The early disciples did it upon the first day of the week. Here is an approved example we regard as a binding pattern upon the people of God today with respect to the time of the observance of the Lord's Supper. But there's the third thing involved in the matter, the frequency of it. While the example shows us is to be done on the first day of the week, the frequency of it, or whether it comes every first day, or just how often we must observe it upon the first day of the week, is revealed to us by means of a necessary inference. Of course, when we talk about necessary inferences, we do not mean possible inferences or probable inferences. We're talking about inferences that are necessary. You take, to illustrate it, the commandment that God gave to Israel in the Old Testament regarding the Sabbath. He said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. God did not in that specify every Sabbath day. God did not say remember every Sabbath day to keep it holy, but he simply said remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But we understand, and the Jews of that time understood, that God required them to observe every Sabbath day. The expression the Sabbath day meant whenever the Sabbath day comes. Upon the same basis, the first day of the week would mean whenever the first day of the week comes. Just as we know that Israel were required to observe every Sabbath day when God said, remember the Sabbath day, then by necessary inference we understand the frequency of the Lord's Supper to be determined by this necessary inference that is to be done whenever the first day of the week arrives. Besides, in the Old Testament, God had various services for men. There were annual services. And if God had intended for this service to be an annual service, he would have specified a certain day of a certain month. You take the Old Testament Passover, and that occurred on the 14th day of the first month. God specified it for that particular time. It couldn't come but once a year. The 14th day of the first month, it could never come except just once a year. It was therefore a yearly service. Or if it had been ordained for a monthly service, then some particular day of the month, not any particular month, but say the 10th day of the month, or something like that. Every time the 10th day of a month would come along, then that would be when the service would be ordained or accepted or observed. But in giving us the Lord's Supper, God did not specify a certain day of a certain month, and therefore it is not an annual service. He did not specify a certain day of a month, therefore it is not a monthly service. But he specified a certain day of the week, which would therefore make it a weekly service, and consequently, by necessary inference, we arrive at the idea that It's to be just as frequent as the first day of the week comes. So we have the commandment given to us to observe the Lord's Supper. We have the time for its observance revealed to us by an approved example, and the frequency of it by a necessary inference. Those are the three ways by which we have divine authority for doing things. We have here the example that the Lord gave when the disciples came together on the first day of the week to break bread, and that's our authority today for observing the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, and that's the only authority we have. There is no specific commandment that says do this on the first day of the week. The authority we have for a first day week of observance of it is by an approved and apostolic example that we regard as a binding pattern upon the people of God today. But there are sometimes details surrounding patterns that are not themselves patterns. Because of that, there are some who contend that everything associated with a matter of benevolence and cooperation must be done, or none of it becomes a pattern. In other words, I showed you in our study last night that the pattern for New Testament cooperation between congregations was always a congregation or a number of congregations having the ability to give, sending to a congregation that was in distress or in need. That's the divine pattern. That's the approved example given to us in the book of God. But surrounding that, there are various incidentals, and men, in order to oppose that as a pattern, have said that all these other things must be patterns too. Everything surrounding the thing must be a pattern, and if it all isn't a pattern, then none of it's a pattern. If they would try to work that sometimes on the patterns of conversions we have given to us in the New Testament, they'd find themselves at sea without a rudder. What if we tried that on some of the examples of conversion? God has given us examples of conversion in the book of Acts. We might take the conversion of the Ethiopian officer in the 8th chapter of Acts. Here we have the man riding in a chariot. He had been up to Jerusalem to worship. He was riding in a chariot on his way back home. An angel directed to Philip to go down to the way that led from Jerusalem to Gaza. He got down to that place where the roads intersect. The Spirit told him to go and join himself to this man. He found the man reading from the prophecy of Isaiah, and he asked him if he understood what he was reading, and learned that he did not, and desired some man to guide him. Philip got up in the chariot and rode with him and began at the same scripture and preached to him Jesus, and as they went on the way, they came to a certain water. The eunuch said, "Here is water, what hinders me to be baptized?" And Philip said, "If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest." He answered and said, "I believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God." The chariot was stopped. They went down to the water. Philip baptized him. They came up out of the water. The man went on his way rejoicing. The Spirit caught Philip away so that the man saw him no more. Here is a divine pattern of conversion. Shall we say that all the incidentals surrounding that must be patterns too? We regard the fact that the man was required to believe as a pattern for conversion today. We regard his baptism as a pattern for conversion today. We regard his confession of Jesus as the Son of God as a pattern of conversion today. But what about the various details of it? Shall we make all of them patterns too and say if they're not all binding, then there's no pattern there? We would, according to the course being pursued by some brethren today. But in that case, in order to have a genuine conversion, then we'd have to have the sinner riding in a chariot. He'd have to be a man who had been to Jerusalem to worship. He'd have to be on his way home when the conversion took place. He'd have to be reading from the prophet Isaiah. Spirit would have to tell a man to go and join himself to the chariot, and the man would have to get up and ride in the chariot with him and preach to him while they were traveling. And then later on, he'd have to stop the chariot and attend to the baptizing, and then the Spirit of the Lord would have to catch the preacher away. Here are a number of incidentals or details surrounding that nobody regards as patterns. If so, then it would conflict with other conversions where we don't have those things, but have some things the very reverse of them. But in every example of conversion, we have a pattern laid down, regardless of the incidentals that surround it. Let us not then confuse some of the detailed incidentals of a pattern with the pattern itself. Now, on this chart I have over here, I have the question, when do examples become patterns? I have some rules suggested there in connection with it I want to study with you tonight. In the first place, if when limited to such, New Testament teaching is not violated. Second, if to do otherwise violates New Testament teaching. Third, if they have significance in the service performed. And fourth, if they are of universal application. Now, those rules come within what we call the rule or the law of harmony. We don't have to have a specific commandment with respect to the law of harmony. We all know that the Word of God is harmonious. Whenever a man interprets a passage of Scripture in any way to conflict with some other passage of Scripture, we know he has the wrong interpretation of it. We know that his exegesis is wrong without any specific commandment regarding the matter. All Scripture must be interpreted or read so as to harmonize with all other Scripture. That's what we call the rule of harmony. Anything that violates the rule of harmony, therefore, is wrong. It will be contrary to the teaching of the Bible. These principles I have given here are included or involved in the idea of the rule of harmony. So if when we limit to such, or when we limit the matter to the example that we have under consideration, New Testament teaching is not violated, then it may be a pattern. But if, when you limit it to that thing, if it violates some other New Testament teaching, then you know it cannot be a pattern. It may be an example, it may be what the apostle did. But if you limit it to that particular thing, it would violate some other New Testament teaching, then you know that you're having a pattern there. Or in the second place, if to do it some other way, if to do otherwise would violate New Testament teaching, then you know you have a pattern there. At the same time, it may have some significance when the service performed. And not always is that true, but it is true with respect to some things. Therefore, that must be involved. Furthermore, the patterns must be of universal applications, or the examples must be of universal application in order to become a pattern. If it couldn't apply to everybody under the same circumstances, why then, of course, it wouldn't be a pattern for us. So those things are apparent upon the very face of them, and they are rules by which we will determine when examples are binding, when examples become patterns. I have on the chart 3 columns that I wish to study. In the first, we have the Lord's Supper. In the second, teaching the Word. In the third, benevolence and cooperation. I've listed in either of these, in each of these, 9 different points to be considered. Others could be added, but these will suffice. We notice in the first column, with respect to the Lord's Supper, that we observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Acts 20:7, to which your attention was called a while ago, the record says on the first day of the week they came together to break bread. So we observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. There's an apostolic example. In the second place, we find another example. They observed this service in an upper room. Actually, when the Lord instituted the supper, as we're told in the books of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark and Luke and so on, that it was an upper room where he instituted the supper. And in Acts the 20th chapter and verse 7, when the disciples there troas met on the first day of the week, the record says there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were. In fact, the record states they were on the 3rd floor. So the supper was there, it was observed in an upper room. In the third place, we find the supper in Acts 27 was observed at a night service. There were many lights in the upper chamber where they were. Paul preached and continued his speech until midnight. In the fourth place, we learned that they used bread and the fruit of the vine. Or, to make it brief, I use the word wine in the sense that it refers to simply fruit of the vine. So the bread and the vine, or the bread and the wine, and the bread before the fruit of the vine. That's the way we observe it today, and that's the way we find it observed in the New Testament, the bread before the fruit of the vine. In this same connection in Acts 27, we find that there was preaching done in connection with the Lord's Supper. Furthermore, we learn in the sixth place that this preaching was done by a traveling preacher, who was the Apostle Paul. He'd been over in some other section of the country, was on his way to another place, stopped at Troas and remained there for 7 days and met with the disciples. On this occasion, when they observed the Lord's Supper, he preached. And not only so, but we learned that he preached until midnight. The record declares plainly that he continued his speech until midnight. In the eighth place, we learned that he raised the dead. A young man by the name of Eutychus went to sleep sitting in the window and fell out and was killed. I could have added that if we wanted to put all the details into it. We didn't have room for all of them. Paul went down and raised the young man from the dead. Then the ninth place, he left early the next morning to join the others who had gone before over to another place. So here are 9 apostolic examples that we have in the first column. Now in the second column, we have teaching the Word. We have a number of examples here of what the apostle did. In the first place, we find there was teaching in an undivided assembly, such as Acts 27, to which your attention has just been called, and where Paul met with them and preached until midnight. Or many other such services we have revealed in the New Testament where the teaching was done in an undivided assembly, with all the assembly in the same place. In the second place, we find that sometime teaching was done by the riverside, Acts the 16th chapter. Paul and Silas went out to the riverside where prayer was wont to be made. Spoke to the women that resorted thither. So there was preaching done by the riverside. That's an apostolic example. In the next place, we find the third place, the teachers sat down while they taught. The record says they sat down and spake to the women that resorted thither. All of that's found, or these 2 points are found in the 16th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. In the fourth place, we find that sometime teaching was done by the apostles in school. Acts 19 and 9, we learn that the apostle Paul disputed in the school of Tyrannus, that he continued for a space of 2 years engaged in that sort of teaching. In the fifth place, we learn that teaching sometimes was done by men while they stood. They were standing and teaching. Acts 5 and verse 25. Men whom you put in prison, the record says, are standing in the temple and speaking to the people or teaching the people. In the sixth place, we find the teaching was oftentimes done in the synagogues. Acts 9 and 20 declares that Paul, just after his conversion, immediately preached Christ in the synagogues of the Jews. Then we learn in the seventh place that teaching was sometimes done simultaneously. Acts 5:25. Here the men are standing and teaching in the temple, which indicates a simultaneous teaching, and I shall notice that a little fuller later on. In the 11th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, we find that there was preaching or teaching done to the Jews only. Those who were scattered abroad upon the persecution of Stephen went as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, teaching the word to none but the Jews only. Then in the 20th chapter of Acts, in verse 20, Paul told the elders of the church at Ephesus that he had taught them publicly and from house to house. There's a number of examples, apostolic examples we have there. Over in the next, we have the column of benevolence and cooperation. We have here also a number of apostolic examples. In the first place, as we have found heretofore, contribution was sent from a church that had an abundance or ability to give to a church that was in need. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 reveal to us that matter, as well as Romans 15, 25, 27, and Acts 11, 27 to 30. Second place, we find that this particular contribution sent to Jerusalem was instigated by an individual That is, it was a man who started the matter, was the Apostle Paul. It was not instigated by some congregation, but by an individual. In the third place, this individual was a foreign member. That is, he was not a member of the congregation where the contribution was being taken at. He came from other places to that. So it was instigated by a foreign member. In the fourth place, the contribution was sent to Jerusalem, among other things, to destroy Jewish prejudice, as is indicated in Romans 15, verses 25 to 26. Then, too, we learned that Corinth had made a pledge a year ahead of time. They had promised a year before to send this contribution. Paul writes them in the second chapter, or the 9th chapter of 2 Corinthians, and calls their attention to it, that he had been boasting to those of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago. He said, your zeal hath provoked many, and so they had pledged themselves a year in advance to send that contribution. In the sixth place, these were Gentile churches who sent contribution to Jewish churches over in Jerusalem, and so on. In the seventh place, the contributions were made to repay spiritual service. Paul in Romans 15 and 26 says that if they're sown unto you spiritual things, and then they certainly reap of you carnal things. Spiritual service had been rendered to them by preaching the gospel to them. Now they send back carnal things or material contributions as a matter of repayment for spiritual service. And the eighth place, the contribution was sent by the hands of messengers. Then we find in the ninth place, with respect to the relief of the widows in Jerusalem in Acts 6th chapter, that the contribution was brought and laid at the apostles' feet. And all of these we have a number of examples given to us in the New Testament. I've selected only 9 in each of them. Others could be selected, but these are sufficient for our study. And in this column over here, the Lord's Supper, we have 9 specific examples given. We regard number 1 as a binding pattern that is to be done on the first day of the week. We regard number 4 as a binding pattern. We use the bread before we use the fruit of the vine. All the other 7 we do not regard as binding patterns. Now why? Why do we regard number 1 and number 4 as binding patterns over here, but none of the rest of them are considered as binding patterns? Why? Well, in the second column, regarding teaching the Word, we have also 9 points, 9 apostolic examples given. Our anti-Bible press or anti-Sunday school brethren regard number 1 as a binding pattern. They say that all teaching must be done in an undivided assembly. They don't regard any of the rest of them as binding patterns. And we who do not agree with our anti-Sunday school brethren do not regard any of these as binding patterns, not even number 1. Why do we not regard these examples as binding patterns on us today? Over in column number 3 of benevolence and cooperation, we who are opposing the brotherhood projects today regard number 1 as a binding pattern. We do not regard the other 8 as binding patterns. Why do we regard the example number 1 as a binding pattern, but do not regard all the others as binding patterns? Brethren who are engaged in the promotion of these brotherhood projects say that none of these is a pattern. If one of them is, all of them must be. If we say number 1 is a binding pattern, every one of these must be binding patterns too, and you can't dispense with any one of them. Well, upon that same basis, why don't you think about this one over here? And say that we regard number 1 as a binding pattern, and we must take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, then we must regard all the rest of them as binding patterns too. If we don't take all the rest of them as binding patterns, then number 1 isn't a binding pattern. I wonder why they don't think about that one. Well, they have been made to think about it just a little. Some of our leaders, some of our preachers today have taken the position that patterns simply exemplify, or rather examples simply exemplify, they do not specify. In other words, it has been said that an apostolic example shows that it's all right to do a thing that particular way. but it doesn't prove that it's wrong to do it some other way. That, they tell us, is the purpose of the examples. It shows that it's all right to do it that way, but it doesn't prove that it's wrong to do it some other way. Not so long ago, I had a round-table discussion down in Texas. This matter came up about binding patterns, or when examples become patterns. The superintendent of the largest orphan home that we have among us today, Brother Gay Lowler, while discussing the matter, said that examples simply exemplify, they do not specify. He said examples show that it's all right to do a thing that way, but it doesn't prove that it's wrong to do it some other way. When he sat down, another preacher got up and said, Brother Oler, try that on Acts 20 and 7. Apply that to Acts 20 and 7. The first day of the week. Upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. There is an example. Try that on that. Well, he got back up and he said, now, this example of meeting on the first day of the week to break bread proves that it's all right to do it on the first day of the week. And if somebody else says that it can be done on some other day of the week, I'll demand that he prove it. But he was reminded that he couldn't do that, because his rule said that it doesn't prove that it's wrong to do it some other way. Therefore, the other fellow wouldn't have to prove it according to that. Finally, he got back up and said, well, I'll just say that Acts 20 and 7, the example given there, shows that it's all right to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, but if you want to do it on Monday or Wednesday or Friday or some other day of the week, I'll not say that it was wrong. Brethren, that's where we're headed. That's where men are being forced to go in an effort to defend brotherhood projects today. In order to do so, they're going to have to eliminate the first day of the week service, the Lord's Supper for the first day of the week. The only authority we have for partaking of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week is an example. If examples never become binding patterns, if they just show that it can be done that way, but it may be done any other way, then you can partake of the Lord's Supper on any day of the week, as well as the first day of the week, and it'll do just as well. A lot of denominations have gone that way. The Christian church has gone that way. Now, a great number of our brethren are headed the same direction. And they're going to have to continue to go that way, or else we'll have to back up on the thing and say that examples may become binding patterns and prove that it's wrong to do a thing some other way. Now then, let us look at these again. Why do we regard two of these as binding patterns and the other 7 as not binding? Remember our rules to govern these matters, and let us look at them and see. Take the first one. On the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. We have here an apostolic example. In that we find there is a significance between the thing done and the day on which it's done. There's a significance in the thing with respect to the service performed, as you note in the third point I have listed here. There were certain words coined by inspired writers in this connection. The New Testament talks about the Lord's Supper, the Lord's body, the Lord's blood, and so on. And the term Lord, in those cases, the Lord's table. The term Lord in those cases comes from an original word that was coined by the apostles and referred to Jesus Christ specifically. Revelation 1 and 10, we have another statement. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. The word Lord's there is a word that points out Jesus Christ specifically, not referring to God the Father, but to the Son. And so the same term referring to the supper and to the day are employed, pointing out Jesus Christ as the one concerned, and therefore there's a direct connection there. Besides, the Lord's Supper must be taken in some sort of an assembly, and the book does require an assembly on the first day of the week, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. When you take all of those things together, then you see the first day of the week has a significance with respect to the service performed. Therefore, it becomes a binding pattern. Well, how about number 2? They observed in an upper room. Is that a binding pattern too? Must we observe the Lord's Supper in the upper story somewhere? Well, let us keep in mind some of the rules. If you limit it to that and it violates some other New Testament teaching, then it wouldn't do. Oh, of course, if you do otherwise would violate New Testament teaching, you would. But if when you limit it to such a thing, it violates other New Testament teaching, then the thing isn't a binding pattern. It would become only an incidental. How about the upper room? Well, if you limit our service to an upper room, if you insist that that becomes a binding pattern, and we must observe the Lord's Supper in an upper room, then you're going to throw yourself into conflict with some other New Testament teaching. In the 4th chapter of John, for example, in the Lord's conversation with the Samaritan woman, there we learn that they discussed religion, and she said, our fathers worship God in this mountain, but you say that Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. The Lord said, the time is coming when even this mountain or yet of Jerusalem you shall worship. You worship, you don't know what. We know what we worship. The salvation is of the Jews. The time is coming when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Under the Old Testament dispensation, there was a locality where worship was carried on. They worshiped God in Jerusalem. God selected a place for that divine worship. The Samaritans have selected the mountain in which they met. So she said, our fathers worship in this mountain. You say Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Worship was localized. But the Lord said, the time is coming when that will no longer be true. Neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem shall you worship the Father. In other words, he's saying the time is coming when worship cannot be localized. He didn't mean that nobody in Jerusalem would worship the Father and nobody in the mountain would. But he meant that you couldn't localize the worship at any particular place. So if we make it an upper room and say it has to be there, then we've localized the thing and throw ourselves into conflict with other New Testament teaching. So we know the upper room cannot be a binding pattern. Well, how about the night service? This service was held at night. Many lights in the upper chamber where they met. Well, that cannot be of universal application. That would violate number 4. That could not be of universal application for the simple fact that at the poles, we have 6 months day and 6 months darkness. And the time is not divided into periods of light and darkness as we have it here, every 24 hours. You can't have it that way. And people in those sections could not observe it in that every 7th day. They couldn't do that. They couldn't have a night service, a service after dark. It wouldn't be possible. So it couldn't be of universal application, so the night service is not a binding pattern. Well, how about the bread before the fruit of the vine? We regard that as a binding pattern. Why? Because it has a significance with respect to the service performed. Jesus said the bread is his body broken for us, the fruit of the vine is his blood that was shed for us. And the body of Jesus Christ was broken or wounded before the blood was shed. Therefore, there's a significance in taking the bread before we take the fruit of the vine. It becomes, therefore, a binding pattern. It has a meaning. It has a significance in the service that's rendered. How about having preaching with the number 5? That couldn't be of universal application. It therefore could not be a binding pattern because every congregation throughout the world could not have preaching every time they have the Lord's Supper. It isn't possible. We have more congregations than we have preachers. And there might be times when there'd be many more congregations and there'd be preachers available. Therefore, you couldn't have preaching every time you had the Lord's Supper, and it couldn't be of universal application. Consequently, it would not be a binding pattern. How about the preaching being done by a traveling preacher as it was upon that occasion? Well, there are not as many traveling preachers as there are preachers. So you wouldn't have enough to go around, and that couldn't be of universal application, so we don't regard the traveling preacher as something essential. How about preaching till midnight? Well, we don't consider that a binding pattern. We find preaching on other occasions that didn't last till midnight. If you find the thing done 2 different ways, then it certainly can't be a binding pattern. One of them would violate the other. If you did otherwise, why, you would be violating, or would not be violating New Testament teaching, but if you limited it to that, you would be. In the 2nd chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, for example, we have preaching on the day of Pentecost, which was another first day of the week. Pentecost always came on the first day of the week. And on that occasion, we find Peter began preaching about 9 o'clock in the morning. He got through with his preaching, closed his sermon, and they still had time to baptize 3,000 souls before the day was over. His preaching did not continue until midnight on that Lord's day. Since we have preaching that didn't continue until midnight, then if you make one of them binding, you throw it into conflict with the other. So we know that they cannot be binding patterns. How about raising the dead, number 8? Well, that couldn't be of universal application. Not all, even in that day, had power to raise the dead. Nobody has power to raise the dead now. Or the gift of miracles has been removed, according to 1 Corinthians 13, 8-10. The things in part have been done away, when that which was perfect is come. Nobody today has the power to raise the dead. And then besides, we don't have some dead to be raised at every service anyway. Every Lord's Day, you don't have somebody to die at the service. In order to make a universal application, we'd have to kill somebody every Lord's Day in order to get it raised from the dead. So that wouldn't work. And about leaving the next morning, well, since you couldn't make the preacher of universal application, there'd be times when the preacher couldn't be there. Of course, they couldn't any preacher leave if he weren't there. So that couldn't be of universal application, and consequently, we can see why in that column we have 2 of them binding patterns, whereas the others are merely incidentals that surround it. For various reasons, as suggested, they could not possibly become binding patterns. Then let us look at this one, number 2. Teaching the Word, first in an undivided assembly. Our anti-Sunday school brethren insist that this is a binding pattern, that all teaching must be done in an undivided assembly. And we have a number of examples where teaching or preaching was done when the whole congregation was assembled in one place, where there was an undivided assembly. Why do we not recognize that as a pattern binding upon us today, just as our anti-Bible class brethren do?
This is the end of Sad 1. Please stop your recorder and turn the tape over. This recording is continued on Sad 2.
Well, because whenever you limit a thing to that, you're going to violate some other New Testament teaching. Over here in number 7, we have teaching simultaneously. Acts 5, verse 25 tells us of the men who had been placed in prison, Peter and John and so on. They were set free. And the next morning they were found missing. Someone came and said, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. Notice, the people are standing in the temple and teaching the people. That was teaching simultaneously. Why? Because we have the present tense used. If someone had said the men stood in the temple and taught the people, you wouldn't know when it took place. One of them might have taught 1 week and another might have taught the next week. One year and another the next year. But if you say that 2 men or a plurality of men are standing and are teaching, that's present tense, and means they are both standing and teaching. If you say that 2 preachers, say Brother Porter and Brother Dye, stood and taught in this building, you wouldn't know when we stood and taught. He might have done it 1 week and I might have done it another. But if you go out here and tell somebody that Brother Dye and Brother Porter are standing and teaching in that building over there, then you understand that we're both standing and we're both teaching at the same time. That, of course, would not be to an undivided assembly, because that would be confusion. The Lord isn't the author of that. That would require a divided assembly for teaching to be done simultaneously. Then, since we find some teaching was done in an undivided assembly and some was done simultaneously, which required a divided assembly, or teaching different groups at the same time, then you can't make a binding pattern out of either of them. One would conflict with the other. In the second place, there was teaching done by the riverside. Why don't we regard that as a binding pattern? Well, because if you limit the matter of teaching to a riverside, then you're going to violate number 4, where we find the teaching was done in the school. You're going to violate number 6, where teaching was done in the synagogues. You're going to violate number 9, where teaching was done from house to house. Unless by some way you can manage to get the school and the synagogues and the houses, all the houses located by the riverside. Well, so we see that couldn't be a binding pattern. It would throw itself into conflict with other statements. When we find things were done different ways, then neither of them can become a binding pattern. In the third place, the teacher sat down while they taught. Why don't we consider that a binding pattern? Well, because if we did so, then that would throw itself into conflict with number 5, in which we find that the apostles were standing and teaching in the temple. So sometimes men sat down when they taught, and sometimes they stood when they taught. If you limit it to one of them, make that a binding pattern, you violate the other. And so number 3 would violate number 5 if you made a binding pattern out of it. Number 4, teaching was done in school. Is that a binding pattern for us? Must we always teach that way? No, because that would throw it into conflict with number 2, the teaching with the riverside, also number 6 in the synagogues, and number 9 from house to house. You can't make a binding pattern out of it. Number 5, they were standing and teaching. Can we make a binding pattern out of that? No, because if you limit it to that, then you're going to violate number 1. Or rather, number 3, I should say. Standing and teaching would violate number 3, which the teacher sat down. So you can't limit to either of them without violating the other. Teaching was done in the synagogues. But we make a binding pattern out of that? Certainly not. For in so doing, we would throw ourselves into conflict with number 4, teaching in the school, number 2, teaching with the riverside, number 9, teaching from house to house. Number 7, we find the teaching was done simultaneously. Can we make a binding pattern out of that? No, because if we do, if we limit our teaching to teaching simultaneously, and say that all teaching must be done that way, then we're going to throw ourselves into conflict with every passage where teaching was done in an undivided assembly. We find in number 8, the teaching was done to the Jews only in Acts 11. Shall we teach the Jews only? Shall we say that all teaching must be done simply to the Jews? Because we read here with an apostolic example, an example of inspired men teaching Jews only. If we do, we're going to violate some other New Testament teaching. We're going to throw ourselves into conflict with something else. For in the Great Commission, the Lord said in Mark 16 and 15, go ye therefore, or rather go into all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature. Matthew 28:19, go ye therefore and teach all nations. Acts 10 reveals to us the preaching and teaching done to the Gentiles. So if we limit our teaching to Jews only, we'll violate those passages that authorize and command us to teach Gentiles. Couldn't make a pattern out of it. How about teaching from house to house? Can that become a binding pattern? Certainly not. And because if you make a binding pattern out of that and say that all teaching must be done from house to house, well, you'd violate even that very same passage, because Paul said, I taught you publicly and from house to house. You'd get away with all public teaching. You'd violate number 6. You'd violate number 4. You'd violate number 2. You'd violate anything that's concerning any teaching anywhere else. So you can't make a pattern out of that. Therefore, none of these in Column 2 can be made into binding patterns. They will not hold up with respect to the rule of harmony that must govern our interpretation of the Scriptures. Then how about number 3, or Column 3, with respect to benevolence and cooperation? We have insisted, as I showed you last night, that the matter of benevolence and cooperation was limited to a church that was in need. No congregation, no number of congregations ever sent a contribution to another church except when the receiving church was in need. It was in distress. It was in the condition of want. And just as soon as that need was relieved, just as soon as the want was met, the contributions were discontinued. No authority in any of the arrangements in the book of God sanction our various brotherhood arrangements today, in which contributions are sent by churches to another church that is not in need, do a work to which they all are equally related. Churches oftentimes that are much inferior financial ability to send contributions to large wealthy churches to do their work for them. We don't have anything like that in the New Testament. We insist number 1 is a pattern. Number 1 becomes a binding example upon us today. Brethren, in order to offset that, say, well, if that's so, then all the rest of them must be binding patterns too. If you're going to say that a church must always be in need to receive contributions from another church, then you're going to have to say that the contribution must be instigated by an individual, That individual must be a foreign member, not a member of the local congregation where the contribution is taken up. And it must be done to destroy Jewish prejudice. It must be pledged a year ahead. It must be sent from Gentile to Jewish churches. It must be done to replace Phillips for service. It must be sent by the hands of messengers and must be laid at the apostles' feet. But they never thought about that over here. They never thought about that over here. If we make the first day of the week a binding pattern, must we make all the rest of them? Send upper rooms binding, and that night services binding, preaching with it, and traveling preaching, the preaching till midnight. Then must be raised, and the preacher must leave the next morning. They never thought about making all of those binding patterns and make the first one so. Yet they're about to give up the first one, as I suggested a while ago. And will have to if they stand by their guns on that particular point. Let us look at this one then and see if one of these can be a binding pattern without the other. And to tell us when we make this a binding pattern, we are parallel with the anti-Bible crass brethren who make number one a binding pattern over here. So the lumpers right in with them and say it's the same old thing, the same old argument exactly that was made over here by the anti-Bible crass brethren. But they never thought about saying if we make this a binding pattern, we're in the same group with them on this. But if we make this a binding pattern, we're right with them this way. Well, let's see if we are. In the matter of number 2, it was instigated by an individual. Why do we not consider that a binding pattern? Well, because we find that to limit it to that thing would violate other New Testament teaching. In Acts 11, verses 27 29, when a contribution was taken of the church at Antioch to be sent down to the churches in Judea, the one who instigated that contribution was not merely an individual. And when in Philippians 4:18, the church in Philippi sent to the Apostle Paul in prison at Rome, the contribution was not instigated by an individual, it was the church taking action. And so you'd throw it into conflict with that. You'd violate New Testament teaching if you made a binding pattern out of that and said it always must be done that way. Well, how about us being a foreign member? That is, not a member of the local congregation where the contribution is being taken. Shall we regard that as binding? No. Why? Well, because we find in Acts 11, 27 to 30, that the contribution that were taken there and the contribution worked up there was worked up by local brethren and not by some person who was a foreign member at all. So it's done both ways, and if it's done both ways, you can't make either of them a pattern. How about breaking down Jewish prejudice? Shall we consider that binding, that all contributions must be done for the purpose of breaking down Jewish prejudice? Well, if we make all the details binding, of course that would be so. But Paul was in prison at Rome, Philippians 4:18. The church of Philippi sent a contribution over there to him to relieve his need. Was that done to break down Jewish prejudice? Did Paul have Jewish prejudice against the Philippian church? Well, certainly not. Paul had established the Philippian church himself. He was the very man that had established the church in the first place. He had no prejudice against that church. There's no Jewish prejudice on his part to break down by that contribution. So when we have a contribution sent that we know that was not sent for that purpose, then neither of them can be made a binding pattern without violating the other. We know that that mustn't be, because then you'll get the Scripture contradicting itself. Number 5, pledge the year ahead of time. Shall we make that a binding pattern? Say that all relief that's given to those in need must be pledged a year in advance, just as Corinth did? If not, why? Well, because the church at Macedonia, right in the same connection, hadn't pledged a year ahead. In fact, Paul had used this fact that Achaia or Corinth had pledged a year ahead as a means of getting the churches in Macedonia to make their contribution. Over in Acts 11, 27 to 30, the church at Antioch that sent relief down to the churches of Judea was not pledged a year in advance. Consequently, if you make this pledging a year in advance a pattern, then you're going to throw it into conflict with something else. You can't do that. You destroy harmony within the Bible if you do. Number 6, the Gentile churches sent to Jewish churches. Shall it always be done that way? Must we make a binding pattern out of that? No. Why? Well, because we find in 2 Corinthians 8, 12 to 14, as I presented last night, Paul said, now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, That is, the Jews now, or the Gentiles now, are sending to Jewish churches. At this time, your abundance, that is the abundance of the Gentiles, will be a supply for their want, that is the want of the Jewish church. Now that when circumstances might become reversed, he said their abundance may be a supply for your want, and so there'd be a contribution coming back under such conditions from Jewish churches to Gentile churches. Paul authorized it both ways. Therefore, you can't select one of them and say that's a binding pattern and cut the other one out. It would be a conflict. You'd make the book contradict itself. Destroy the law of harmony. Number 7, to repay spiritual service. How about that? Well, in the very same way, we find contributions made that were not made to repay spiritual service. In 1 John 3:17, for example, the Apostle John said, if any man see his brother have need, and shut up his bowels of compassion, how dwells the love of God in him? Not merely a brother who has rendered some spiritual service to you. Not a matter of repaying spiritual service, but just any brother that's in need. He said, you mustn't shut up your bowels of compassion, so we have it done otherwise. Consequently, you can't make a binding pattern out of either of them. Sent by messengers, how about that? Well, we have relief administered when messengers were not used. In the 6th chapter of Acts, when the widows were cared for in the daily administration in the church at Jerusalem, there was no use of messengers. Well, somebody said it wasn't sent somewhere else. That's exactly it. No messengers were needed. And the reason the messengers were needed here was because it was sent somewhere else and there was no postal system to send it by. The only way to get anything to another place, either a letter, a contribution, or anything else, was to send it by the hand of somebody who would make the trip. Consequently, that was merely an incidental that cannot become a binding pattern. How about it being laid at the apostles' feet, as the contribution was in Acts 6? That couldn't be of universal application because we have no apostles at whose feet to lay it. There are no apostles today. The apostles did not have successors on down through the years. No men are qualified to be such. There are no apostles now, and consequently it would be utterly impossible to lay it down at the apostles' feet. Number 9 could not be of universal application. So 8 of these cannot be made into binding patterns, for if you do, you're going to violate other teaching of the New Testament somewhere. Not so with number 1. In the matter of number 1, there is no example of it being done any other way, and therein it is not like this. Any Bible class brethren say this is a binding pattern, and we can show them it's not a binding pattern, because here we find it done in another manner, where there was group teaching absolutely necessary for 2 men or more to teach at the same time. Consequently, we have the teaching done on other occasions, under other circumstances, than in an undivided assembly. You can't make that a binding pattern. But can you find the same thing regarding this over here? Can you find a case somewhere where a contribution was sent to another church that was not in need? If you can, then this is parallel with this. Or we find where this was done another way. But this is not parallel with that, for the simple fact you can't find where this was done another way. And the very minute somebody will find in the book of God where a contribution was sent from one church to another church that was not in need, then that very minute I admit that number 1 is not a binding pattern here. And we have no binding patterns in the matter of congregational cooperation. I feel that by these you're able to see the reason some examples become binding and others are not binding. This will help us to understand when examples do become binding patterns. Not everything the apostles did, not everything inspired men did can be made into binding patterns. Many of them are mere incidentals, as has been shown in this connection with respect to all 3 of these matters: the Lord's Supper, teaching the Word, benevolence, and cooperation. But in some of them we do have binding patterns. We have 2 of them in the column number 1, whereas the rest of them are mere incidentals. But you cannot make into binding patterns without violating New Testament teaching. In column number 2, we have 9 apostolic acts, or acts of inspired men, examples of inspired men, and not a one of them can be made into a binding pattern, for the simple fact if you do so, you're going to throw it into conflict with some other passage of Scripture. Whenever you find the thing is done different ways, and then it can't be a binding pattern in either case. In this we have First, the church in need, and that's the only condition under which a contribution was ever made from one church to another. It becomes a binding pattern, whereas in all the other cases we have mere incidentals that cannot be made into binding patterns without violating New Testament teaching. We must always observe the rule of the law of harmony in the book of God, knowing that the book of God is always harmonious, and if we put in an interpretation upon it that throws that passage into conflict with some other passage, then we know we have the wrong interpretation. We do have our pattern, the church in need. And that church in need receives contributions because it is in need. No other kind in the book of God ever received the contributions from another church. Therefore, it becomes a binding pattern for us to observe in our congregational cooperation today. When brethren endeavor to set this aside because there are incidentals surrounding it, the same thing must be done in the first column with respect to the Lord's Supper, being observed on the first day of the week, and using the bread before we use the fruit of the vine. So remember that all examples are not necessarily binding. We can determine by the use of the rule of harmony as to when an example is binding. If you find it done two ways, then it cannot be binding. You don't find this done two ways. You find it only one way. And these are but mere incidentals surrounding that. In every case of cooperation, there are incidentals, and the incidentals don't always agree, just as they don't always agree in the matter of conversion. You take the conversion of the Ethiopian officer that I gave a while ago, and you take the conversion of Saul of Tarsus in the next chapter of Acts. You'll find the pattern the same in both of them, the pattern of conversion. The same things were required, the same things were done in order to accomplish the salvation of the soul. But the incidentals surrounding the two cases of conversion are not the same at all. Not at all. That doesn't mean there's no pattern in either of them, just because the incidentals are not the same. Brethren have argued with respect to the cooperation matter that since in Acts 11 we have one church sending to a number of churches, but in Romans 15 we have a number of churches sending to one church, then neither of them can be a pattern because you have it reversed. It's done two different ways. Nobody claims that part of it's a pattern. Certainly not. Nobody claims that's a pattern. The mere fact that one church sends to a number of churches is not a pattern, or that a number of churches sends to one church isn't a pattern. The same pattern exists in both of them. The receiving churches were in need in both cases. So it is every time a contribution comes to a church. The church is in need. There's your pattern, whether it comes from one church or whether it comes from a group of churches. The same need is there. The same condition is there. The same things to be met, the same works to be accomplished, that there may be equality. The same design exists there. That's where the pattern is. Just because you find some of them used messengers and some of them didn't, some of them tried to break down Jewish prejudice, and some of them didn't, some of them had a foreign member to instigate it, and some of them didn't. Sometimes related to the apostles' feet, and sometimes it wasn't. Doesn't set aside at all the fact that in every case the contribution came to a church that was in need. That is where the pattern is. We don't have anything parallel to it with the anti-Sunday school brethren whatsoever. Just isn't that. Now that's the lesson for your consideration tonight. I trust it helps you to an understanding of these things regarding the examples that God has given us. So let us remember that we have three ways by which things are authorized: by a specific or direct commandment, by an approved example that becomes a binding pattern upon us, and by a necessary inference. Not a possible or a probable inference. It's not the kind of inferences that people draw when they try to prove infant baptism or sprinkling or pouring or something of that kind. People try to prove infant baptism from the household conversions, the house of the jailer and Lydia's household and so on, by insisting that if the household was baptized, that included the babies too. That's an inference, but that's not a necessary inference, because there are many households that don't have any babies in them. Oftentimes there are households that don't even have children. There are others who have a number of children, but the children are all grown. No infants there to baptize. You could baptize the whole household without baptizing any baby. So they prove it by an inference, but that's not a necessary inference. We're not talking about that. That doesn't prove anything. We're talking about a necessary inference, something that's said in the matter that makes necessary that conclusion. That's the way we get our necessary inference. And the example becomes binding if it meets within the realm of the law or rule of harmony as suggested here. It doesn't violate any New Testament teaching and it's never done any other way. Then that becomes a binding pattern for us. So with these thoughts for your study, if you are here tonight who are not Christians, you'd like to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, the opportunity is yours. We're going to sing the song. Ask the congregation to stand, please, while we sing, and we invite you to come.
When we behold the wonders of creation, the flowers that bloom, the rainbows that they fall, the gracious God provides perpetuation, we cannot doubt that God controls it all. Lord, I believe, Lord, I believe, yes, I believe, yes, I believe, I cannot doubt, I cannot doubt, I believe, I believe, calculator should frame the truth revealed within His word. In every place of nature's operation, thy voice so loud in history can be heard. Lord, I believe, Lord, I believe, yes, I believe, yes, I believe, I cannot doubt, I cannot doubt, I believe, I believe, I believe, never fall, when we perceive the state of alien nation in which the soul from thee, O God, was lost, we must believe by that Lord and nation, our Lord redeemed the face of nature cost. Lord, I believe, Lord, I believe, yes, I believe, yes, I believe, I cannot doubt, I cannot doubt, I believe, I believe, I believe, never fall, nothing else, it all. When days are filled with joy and expectation, some days are dark with days beyond despair. In hours of joy or hours of tribulation, be with us, Lord, lest we forget. Lord, I believe, Lord, I believe, yes, I believe, yes, I believe, I cannot doubt, I cannot doubt, I believe, I believe, I believe, never fall, the blessing and the